I never thought those words would cut so deep. Not from her. Not after everything. It started like any other fight. Raised voices, slammed doors, the usual tension that had been building for months. My stepdaughter, Emily, was 16 and had never fully accepted me. I understood. Her dad had walked out when she was little, and her mom, Sarah, had raised her alone until I came along 3 years ago. I tried my best, helped with homework, drove her to practice, even swallowed my pride when she rolled her eyes at my attempts to bond. But that night, something snapped. Emily had come home late, again, and Sarah was furious. Groundings, threats, the whole routine. I stayed quiet at first, knowing my input would only make it worse. But then Emily turned to me, her eyes burning. "This is your fault," she spat. "Everything was fine before you showed up." I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but Sarah jumped in. "Emily, that's enough." But Emily wasn't done. "Why don't you just disappear?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "We'd be better off without you." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to defend me, to tell Emily that wasn't true. Instead, she sighed and rubbed her temples. "Emily, go to your room. We'll talk about this later." No denial. No reassurance. Just exhaustion. That's when I knew. I didn't argue. Didn't yell. Just turned and walked upstairs. I pulled out my old duffel bag from the closet and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, the few things that were truly mine. Sarah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're really leaving?" she asked, like she couldn't believe it. I zipped the bag shut. "You didn't exactly give me a reason to stay." She flinched, but didn't argue. That hurt more than Emily's words. The drive to a cheap motel was a blur. I checked in, collapsed onto the stiff mattress, and stared at the ceiling. 3 years. 3 years of trying, of loving them both. And in the end, it took 5 words to undo it all. "Why don't you just disappear?" My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "I'm sorry." She didn't mean it. I didn't reply, because the truth was, Emily had meant it. And worse, so had Sarah. I didn't sleep that night. The motel room smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener, and every time I closed my eyes, Emily's words echoed in my head. "We'd be better off without you." By morning, my phone was flooded with missed calls and texts, mostly from Sarah, a few from coworkers wondering why I wasn't at work. I silenced it. The idea of facing anyone, even just to call in sick, made my chest tighten. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. For a stupid second, my heart leapt. Maybe it's Sarah, maybe she came to fix this. But when I opened it, it was just the motel manager, an older guy with tired eyes, holding out a wrinkled receipt. "Checkout's at 11, he grunted. I paid for another night just to buy myself time. Sarah's texts grew more desperate. "Please talk to me. Emily feels awful. We need you to come home." That last one almost made me laugh. Home. Was it ever really mine? I thought about the early days, when Sarah and I were just dating. Emily was colder back then, but I figured she'd warm up. Sarah promised she would. "She just needs time," she'd say, squeezing my hand. 3 years. How much time was enough? I finally caved and called my brother, Mark. He picked up on the first ring. "Dude, where the hell are you? Sarah's been calling me nonstop." I swallowed hard. "Did she tell you what happened?" "Yeah. Look, kids say messed up stuff when they're angry. You know that." "It wasn't just Emily," I said quietly. "Sarah didn't even defend me." Mark sighed. "Okay, that's rough. But are you really gonna bail without even talking to them?" I didn't have an answer. That evening, I drove past the house. Just once. Just to see. Emily's car was in the driveway. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, I could see Sarah at the table, her head in her hands. Emily was next to her, shoulders hunched. They looked lost. For a second, I almost walked in. Then I remembered the silence after Emily's words. The way Sarah didn't say that's not true. The way she just let it hang there, like maybe, on some level, she agreed. I drove away before they could see me. 3 days after I left, Sarah showed up at the motel. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, half watching some crime documentary, when there was a knock, not the manager's impatient rap, but something softer, hesitant. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. Sarah stood there, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a paper bag. "You haven't been answering your phone," she said. Her voice was raw, like she'd been crying. I stepped aside to let her in, not trusting myself to speak. She set the bag on the dresser. "I brought you some clothes. And your toothbrush." A weak attempt at a smile. "You always forget your toothbrush." I stared at the bag. It was such a normal thing, something she'd done a dozen times before when I traveled for work. But now it felt like a peace offering, or a eulogy. "Emily's sorry," Sarah blurted out. "She didn't." "Stop," I cut in. "Just stop." My hands were shaking. "This isn't about Emily anymore. It's about you." Sarah flinched. That night, when she said those things, "You didn't say a damn word to defend me." My throat tightened. "You just let her believe it was true." Sarah's face crumpled. I was tired, she whispered. I didn't even process what she said until you were already gone. That's the problem. I sank onto the bed. After 3 years, defending me should have been instinct. But it wasn't. And that tells me everything. Silence. Then, quietly. So that's it? You're just done. I looked at her, really looked. The woman I'd loved, the life I'd tried to build. And I realized, I was already a ghost in that house. A placeholder. A temporary fix. Yeah, I said finally. I think I am. Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded, wiped her eyes, and walked out. A month later, I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment across town. Sarah and I exchanged a few logistical texts, mail forwarding, the cable bill, but nothing more. Then, one evening my doorbell rang. Emily stood on the doorstep, shifting awkwardly. She thrust a crumpled envelope at me. I wrote you a letter, she mumbled. But then I figured I should just say it. I waited. I didn't mean it, she said, voice breaking. I was mad, and I wanted to hurt you, and a tear rolled down her cheek. I miss you. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel it. The loss, the love, the unfairness of it all. I miss you too, kid, I said. But some things can't be unsaid. She nodded, crying harder now. I pulled her into a hug, and for a second, it was like old times. Then she left, and this time, I was the one who didn't stop her.